It's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to the Ramsey Dewey Show. I'm going to discuss some comments, not questions, so I guess it's not Q&A with the coach today. I got a comment from footwork 5 days ago who said, I think if boxers and Sanda guys, Sanda, if you don't know, is Chinese kickboxing, that also includes throws and takedowns. So you score from punching, kicking, and throwing the other guy on the floor, but there's no ground fighting. If boxers and Sanda guys practiced forms for cardio rather than running, it would definitely be a competitive advantage. I replied by asking him, what kind of forms are you talking about specifically? His reply, traditional forms, Kungfu forms, the longer the better. I don't think the specific form really matters. Repetition of forms is great cardio and helps footwork, flexibility, and positioning, in addition to being a representation of fighting multiple opponents at once. It seems a more logical practice to me than just road work or jumping rope. To which I replied, footwork is technique specific. For example, how is a Hongjia twin form, for example, where you squat in a horse stance with 6 kilos of iron rings on each wrist? How is that supposed to improve your footwork for a check hook in boxing? The athletic crossover isn't there. I'm not an advocate of distance running for combat sports athletes either. It's a very different physical demand on the body and set of breathing patterns than fighting, and the athletic crossover is much lower than most people think. As far as running goes, I've made a few videos on this, about the cardio myth, largely about the idea that distance running is the ideal way to condition you to breathe for a fight. There are worse things you can do than distance running. If you like it, if it's giving you the benefit that you want, cool. Keep doing it. However, if you're looking for the most efficient thing, you might want to keep looking. But our friend footwork had a few more things to say. He said, I was thinking of forms from styles such as Cheng Chuan or Long Chuan, for example. Cheng Chuan, that would be long fist, Shaolin long fist. The modern long fist forms started in the 1950s. Thanks to the Chinese Communist Party and the formation of the Chinese Wushu Federation. They essentially changed the forms, trying to hybridize them, make them more streamlined, more audience-friendly, etc. So, if you learn modern Wushu, your Cheng Chuan forms are going to be quite a bit different than what they used to be. Long Chuan, that would be Dragon Fist. As far as I know, that's a made-up style. I mean, they're all made-up styles, but it's a fairly recent made-up style for the movies, for tourists. Now, I've heard some people, particularly folks in the West who practice dragon-style Kung Fu, Dragon Fist, trying to justify their position by saying, oh no, there's some ancient monk that did this thing. As far as I know, it's a modern contrivance. That doesn't mean it's bad. Just let's be honest about where our martial arts come from. Most traditional martial arts are not that old. We've discussed this quite a bit on this channel. On with the reply. But footwork says these are great for cardio in addition to working on honing Fajin movement. Oh, he's one of those guys who likes to throw out Romanized Chinese words as jargon instead of just saying what he means and translating. Okay. And one of the problems of writing it in pinyin, in the Roman alphabet, is that Chinese words have tons and tons of homonyms. Now, I know what he means because there are so many Tai Chi nerds out there on the internet who use this jargon and often use it wrong. But anyway, Not a big fan. Pick a language and stick to it. Let's do that. Let's do that, friends. So how about next time you're in a jiu-jitsu class and you're teaching about triangle chokes? Can you just say triangle choke instead of sankaku jime? There's a fundamental asymmetry in the human body when we attempt the sankaku jime between the upper extremities and the lower extremities. No, I'm not picking on John Danaher. Maybe I am a little bit. Maybe a little bit. There's more to this reply. Not a lot of boxers understand the concept of jing. Now, I'm not sure if he understands what he means by jing, because I don't understand what he means by jing. I know lots of Chinese words that sound like jing, 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 etc. And that could mean a lot of different things. So instead of just trying to use Chinese jargon, say what you mean. Let's translate that. I had a great conversation with my new friend David. He came and visited the gym. He's a friend of the channel, longtime subscriber. Came and trained at a jiu-jitsu class I was teaching, and we totally nerded out about martial arts forms after class. It was a good time. I'd love to make a whole video about nerding out about martial arts forms and applications and stuff. But one thing that impressed me about David is, while we were discussing Tai Chi, he understood exactly what all this jargon means. So that's important. And you know, be able to say it in the language you're speaking. If you're speaking Chinese, okay, use Chinese terms. If you're speaking English and you mean power, just say power instead of bao fa li or something like that. Come on, man. I think in the future, the very best Sanda fighters and boxers will utilize these types of concepts. I hate when someone denigrates a martial art that has been around 1,000 years. I want to know which martial art has been around 1,000 years. Some of you are probably typing in the comments, well, Ramsey, my system has been around for thousands of years. And you probably practice a style that comes from the 1900s. But I'm very curious, which style specifically are you talking about that's been around for 1,000 years? And some of you might be thinking, well, isn't like Tai Chi ancient? It's older than you, it's older than your mom, it might be older than your grandpa, but as far as I understand it, the Tai Chi forms, the styles that we know today, are no older than 300 years, if that. I hate it when someone denigrates a martial art that has been around 1,000 years just because no current students of that style is currently in the UFC. Yeah, a lot of people, and this is a salient point you're making right there, how people will often brush off something they haven't seen in the UFC. And there's a simple reason for that. We cannot believe, let me rephrase that, I got that backwards. We cannot see what we don't already believe. And people who believe that the UFC represents what works in a fight, they won't be able to see a technique unless it works in the UFC. So, for example, recently, Islam did that cool golf swing takedown. It's a classic Tai Chi move. It's a classic Sanda technique. It's a move used in Muay Thai. It's a move used in freestyle wrestling, but a lot of people are not familiar with it. It's one of those niche moves that a lot of people simply don't practice and don't learn, and they've never seen it. But now that it happened in the UFC, a lot of people recognize it. A lot of people are out there training this move. And as soon as Islam did that move in the UFC, my inbox blew up and they were like, Ramsey, that move you're always teaching on your channel, I saw it in the UFC. Wow, that blew my mind. I didn't know that was real. Well, of course it's real. Everything works when it works. But anyway, I agree with you. As in other videos you mentioned, the arts are mostly lost except to a few old heads that still practice in the traditional way. And the traditional way would be get out there and train, put what you practice to the test, drill and spar and all that good stuff so you know how to fight rather than just being martial pretenders of the partial arts. Yes, I said partial arts. Last sentence, we need to revitalize that. Well, yeah, that's what every combat sports athlete and coach is doing. They're revitalizing that method of training. The old get out there and train method of training. It totally works. Not simply throw it away and say, it only looks good in the movies. Movies bastardize forms. I just recently watched the latest season of Cobra Kai, and it's a fun show. I'm not saying don't go watch that show. It's fun. But in the fight scenes, they're using the traditional martial arts blocks, the high block, the middle block, the low block, to block punches coming from a mile away that aren't actually close enough to make any contact. And they're hi-ya, hi-ya. And this is a fantasy propagated by martial arts instructors, that these movements are specifically to intercept punches. And while it's in the realm of possibility, you don't do that. I don't do that. And it's not for a lack of trying. In all the years I spent practicing these forms, doing them over and over again, thinking, I will use these movements in actual combat, and then attempting them in sparring sessions and never being able to reliably and consistently block punches with them, I realized something is wrong with this methodology. Perhaps this movement is not intended to intercept a punch coming at you at all. Maybe the application is something different. And as the years went on, I found vastly different applications that totally work and I totally use all the time now, that have absolutely nothing to do with blocking punches. But I'm watching Cobra Kai and they're like, hi-ya, hi-ya, blocking punches with these forearm movements, doing the hikite, pulling their arm down out of the way for no reason at all. There is a very specific combat application of pushing one arm away and pulling the other in. Why? It makes a great way to strip and exchange and reverse grips. Grips as in someone grabs you, something which is illegal in karate tournaments today anyway, thus negating like 90% of what we learn in the forms, all the grappling technique. Anytime you bring the arms close to the body in some way, in a form, it's generally a grappling technique. It's performed today with this punctuated striking as if it were punching and kicking, which it's weird. It's weird that we do that now. If you look at earlier versions of those forms that came from China, you'll notice they're performed more flowy. Why? Because shadow wrestling is flowy. It's got a flowy movement pattern to it, not a ha, ha, ha type of movement all the time, as if it were punching and kicking. Because modern karate tournaments are punching and kicking. But actual karate movements, they're not all punching and kicking. If you look at the forms, the punches and the kicks are actually the minority of the movements. It's something that happens in a fight, but there's a lot of other stuff that happens in a fight. So let's address a few points that Futzerg brought up here. So he believes if boxers and Sanda fighters will practice Kungfu forms, they will become much better than the current boxers and Sanda fighters that we have today. Well, I've got some news for you about the way Sanda is trained in China at the major sports universities. I've trained at 3 different Sanda camps here in China, including at the Xi'an Sport University of Sport. And I have trained with a few different Sanda national champions. I fought 2 different Sanda national champions, Chinese national champions. That's a big deal in this country. That's a big tournament. It's the biggest tournament in China. And it's a very long one, too. You got to beat everybody to become the Sanda Wang, the king of Sanda. So I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just saying that, well, maybe a little bit. I'm saying that to brag about my credentials here. What credentials? My experience, not credentials. Let's get that straight. Sanda is one of 3 sub-subjects of a wushu degree. You can get a degree in wushu at a Chinese sport university. And you can specialize in taolu, that's forms. You can specialize in shuaijiao, traditional folk wrestling with the jacket. Or you can specialize in sanda, kickboxing with the throws and the takedowns. And everybody who goes through that program, they dabble in all of those things, but they specialize in one of them. The Sanda fighters learn the forms until they get essentially accepted into the program. When they get in there deep, they focus exclusively on competition, training to compete. And forms don't factor into that. But those guys are familiar with the forms. Did the forms make them good Sanda fighters? They probably didn't make them worse, but a lot of what happens in those forms is so radically different from what happens in a Sanda fight. So you mentioned footwork, and I gave you a counter-argument. If we look at any specific martial arts form, any Kungfu form, you mentioned, what did you mention? Chung Chuen, Shaolin Long Fist, Northern Shaolin, whatever you want to call it. And you move your feet in these forms. You get in a lot of very deep lunging type of stances in these forms. You assume positions you will never assume in a Sanda fight or a boxing match. Like I said to you, footwork is technique specific. Every technique has its own relative footwork. The footwork for a jab with a falling step, for example. You drop your weight onto your lead foot, taking a small step forward as you extend the jab. That's the footwork. Doing a Chung Chuen form, for example, is not going to emulate that footwork. It's not going to make you better at that footwork. What will make you better at a falling step with a jab? Practicing the falling step with a jab. Shadow box that movement. Get on a heavy bag and practice that movement against the heavy bag. Have a pad holder hold pads free and practice that movement on the pads. Spar and practice that movement in sparring. Pretty simple stuff that every competitive fighter knows and does. I've mentioned the check hook. It's a very specific movement pattern. You take a little step this way and you pivot. And as you pivot, you throw that hook. And the hook comes in with the weight of your body behind it. And so you can flank your opponent. But if I am doing a Kungfu form that is not that specific footwork, it doesn't make me better at that footwork. So, going back to Sanda fighters, again, these guys are familiar with forms. Essentially, the better they get, the less they practice the forms. And those things are directly related. They practice the forms for scholastic purposes so they can get their degree. And when they get serious about competition, they're no longer doing that stuff. How do successful Sanda practitioners train? Well, generally they train 3 times a day, 3 2-hour sessions, and it is moderate intensity, a lot of skill drills, some fairly light sparring, and the Sanda camps I worked at did not put any emphasis on road work. Like, fighters could do that if they wanted to, but that was extracurricular. That wasn't part of the 3 training sessions a day. So, not a lot of running went on. Every moment of every training session was utilized efficiently. It all had a purpose. And something you might not know about the way Sanda fighters train, they tend to cross-train. It's not competitive Kung Fu, if you will. And I say Kung Fu in the colloquial sense, meaning Chinese traditional martial arts. That's not actually what it means. So they cross-train in boxing, they cross-train in Muay Thai, they cross-train in karate, they cross-train in Taekwondo, they cross-train in folk wrestling, specifically Chinese folk wrestling, because the throws and the takedowns from Chinese folk wrestling are the ones you use in Sanda, for the most part, except for the ones that require a grip on a jacket, because one, you don't wear a jacket in Sanda, and two, you have to do every throw and takedown wearing boxing gloves, which changes the sport dramatically. Will the forms make you worse? I was about to say probably not, but misunderstanding and misappropriating forms definitely can make you worse. So for example, if you learn a bunch of Taekwondo forms, which have movements that come from Shotokan, that come from earlier karate forms, and you learn all these blocks inside middle block, upward block, mountain block, whatever, and you believe that these are to intercept punches, you're going to have a really rough day. And that will actually make you worse. Until you learn the valuable lesson, that's not what it's for. And ultimately, in the long run, many years hence, it might make you better. But if you're a professional fighter, or aspiring to become such, you don't have many, many, many years to learn a bunch of valuable lessons through trial and error. You've got a relatively short time, so you need to economize what you are doing. You need to get the most bang for your buck. And is doing a bunch of Kung Fu forms, which requires many hours of practice just to remember them, just to memorize all of these movements, most of which will not be combat applicable in your sport at all. Like, at all. You would get the same or similar benefit from doing ballroom dance. Or modern dance. Or folk dance. Or ballet. I've done all of those things. I have a degree in dance. And I've fielded the question many times on this channel, how does dance benefit a martial artist? And the answer is, well, if there's benefit, it's a very roundabout type of benefit, because the direct athletic crossover isn't exactly there. You might point to certain athletic attributes you can gain from dance, coordination, flexibility, balance, general stuff like that. But do you know what's even better as a martial artist? Develop all those athletic attributes and the necessary skills to compete in your sport simultaneously. And then you've got direct athletic crossover and athletic experience, which is much, much more valuable than trying to fit pieces of the puzzle together that leads you to simply playing catch-up to everybody else that started doing the thing to do the thing. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.